Good morning. I want to thank everybody who joins us. My name is Oleh Ivanov. It's my pleasure to see everyone who joins us in Ukraine Media Center, both offline and online. So today we have invited you to talk on a very important topic. Today we will have the presentation of the so-called MPs Performance Ratio. We will be talking about the way that the people's deputies work without the pressure of elections. We understand that during peacetime, the nice session of the parliament cadence would expire, but the full-scale invasion changed the situation dramatically. We see that now our colleagues from Vox Ukraine are about to help us understand what is the MPs performance ratio. We will be talking about the results and conclusions to be drawn from this survey, and right away I will ask our colleagues how the regular average Ukrainians would be able to use that tool, how they would understand that this or that people's deputy is useful. So let me introduce our speakers. Joining us today in our studio are Oleksandr Korniyenko, first deputy chair of the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine. Also joining us is Dariia Kolodiazhna, data analyst at Vox Ukraine Reform Index Project, Oleh Ivanov, analyst at Vox Ukraine NGO, and Oleksandr Salizhenko, editor-in-chief at CHESNO. Thank you very much for joining us. So Dariia, let's start with you. Please make a presentation. The floor is yours. Well, good morning. Good morning, everybody, once again. My name is Dariia Kolodiazhna, and I'm a data analyst at Reforms Index at Vox Ukraine. Today, I want to tell all of you about the deputies' performance ratio. Another name of it is the usefulness ratio. So what are the methodologies used and so on? Let's see. Generally, Vox Ukraine and Reforms Index is involved in collection of key reformation draft laws, and now there are 1,647 different acts and laws that are on the database, on our database. And this database that includes, that has the reforms related laws and acts, so basically those laws that influence the economic condition of Ukraine, we've built this performance ratio tool, online tool. So how does it happen? How is it being calculated? First of all, we look through all of the laws that were adopted. We select the most important ones and we send them for evaluation of more than 40 independent experts who evaluate the law or draft law, and they come up with the opinion whether that draft law may be a game changer in Ukraine. So every draft law gets a mark from -5 to +5. So -5 is the mark that is given to anti-reformation laws. Thankfully, we had no such draft laws in our database, but it should be something that makes significant negative changes to the legislation of Ukraine. So generally, all those laws that are added to Reforms Index, they do not exceed +2 or -2 on our scale. Then those draft laws, as they are being adopted, we review the voting by every single people's deputy. So we take every single deputy and we follow them whether they were voting pro or con, or nay or yes. And then we calculate like 100% rating, maybe applied to those deputies who were voting for reforms-related draft laws and were voting against anti-reform-related draft laws. And then we calculate the ratios of all of, or ratings of all of the people's deputies based on that information. In the same way, we follow reformation draft laws by sectors, for example, public finance or public administration or social policies. And in that breakdown, we can see to what extent every single people's deputy supports reforms, which reforms they support most and which reforms they support less. Also, we calculate the average rating as an accumulated indicator from the first to the very last session, to the very last update, covering, for example, 10 sessions of the parliament, and we calculate the average from second to the 10th session, because the first session was lasting only 1 day. Yeah, right here on the screen we can see People's Deputy Dmitro Kurin. Is it correct? Do we understand it correct that he has a 100% rating? No, his number is 22, and is just the example of how the performance ratio website looks like. So let's give more comments, like why this specific people's deputy is on the screen. No, he's just lucky. He's just lucky to serve as an example. So we will proceed to the leaders of the rating a little bit later. And also, I would like to emphasize one important disclaimer. We understand that performance ratio is not the only tool that demonstrates how the usefulness of the people's deputies can be tracked in compliance with the law of Ukraine on people's deputies. This law actually vests way more rights and responsibilities in them. And for example, civil organization CHESNO, they have a political hub where the biographies of all of the people's deputies are collected, and we may see in their database whether they were ending up in some bad situations, like voting for some harmful legislation and so on and so forth. But we think that voting for the draft laws that are crucial to Ukraine is one of the most important things. So let's proceed to the results of this parliament work. After 10 sessions, we can draw certain conclusions. So finally, we see the leaders of the rating. On the first place is Tararin Mykola and Natalia Loktionova. They joined the parliament just recently during the 9th session. This is why they were able to maintain their 100% rating. They were voting for all of the reforms. Thankfully, within the last year or even more, there were no anti-reformation draft laws. Even if a people's deputy was coming and voting, they would end up in the top rating. And then we see, for example, Oleksandr Pasechny. He is in the top rated he has been in the top rating for the last 10 sessions since 2019. His rating is 95 plus, and he's a keen adherent of reforms. Among others in the top of the rating, there are others joining somewhere in the middle, and those who were not able to lose their first places so far, because sometimes we see that novices, they sometimes take first places, but after a couple of sessions, the rating is lowering. So everybody whom we see in the top are the representatives of the people's servant, because they need to have the most votes possible to have the draft laws initiated by them adopted. So basically, the legislative initiative comes from the people's servants. Talking about reformers who have more than 90% rating are representatives of people's servant. And talking about the biggest anti-reformers, the picture is quite stable. For example, the top is changing depending on those who come as a novices. The anti-reformers are the same within those 10 sessions, and after the 10th session update, we see no representatives of opposition who changed their attitude dramatically after the beginning of the full-scale invasion, and currently in the last places are representatives of Batkivshina, Відновлення України, and За майбутнє. In the last place is Mikhailo Sokolov, who has only joined during the 10th session, and all the rest of them have been people's deputies since the very beginning. Mr. Mikhailo Sokolov got 0% efficiency rating because during his parliamentary work he voted for 0 draft laws. And now let's proceed to the aggregated data. It's quite it's not unexpected to see the average performance ratio for every parliamentary fraction, and People's Servant is way ahead. Again, I would like to emphasize that from the very beginning of their work, it has never changed. The only case when you see the Holos representative in the first place, it was a novice deputy who unfortunately later lost his first place. Then we see Dovira, the trust, and we know that quite frequently they support the People's Servant during their vote, and they help them find necessary votes when the People's Servant can't find the necessary number. That's why their ratings frequently coincide. They're like on the heels of People's Servant. Golos, the Voice, and yes, European Solidarity vote for the majority of the Reformation laws and in the sector of social reforms, and not always in the area of public administration. For example, what remains unchanged during all of the 10 sessions is Batkivshina, who stably remains on the last places. They are very oppositional fraction with extremely low ratings. Sometimes it happens so that their deputies were having negative rating. It happened also to oppositional bloc, when the People's Deputies were voting for 0 reformation draft laws, but they voted for anti-reformation draft laws. For example, the laws that increase the corruption risks, and oppositional bloc, they vote frequently for such types of legislation. In this slide, well, it's pretty extensive. We will be able to track the whole history from the very beginning until the very end. Here we see the average ratings fraction by fraction, but in breakdown by sessions. And again, let's start with the People's Servant. There are 2 peaks here. Well, the first session was only lasting 1 day, and the second session was about turbo regime that everyone remembers. And during that time, People's Servants deputies gained a rating of 95%. During that first session, 63 reformation laws were adopted, and more than 1,600 draft laws were registered in the parliament during that period. But in the summer 2020, there was a coronavirus crisis, and Goncharuk cabinet resignation. The monomajority started splitting up, and that was the first stage of that split. And we can see the same picture for all of the People's Deputies fractions. And when People's Servants did not have enough necessary votes, they were getting votes from other fractions. For example, quite visible here is the European Solidarity. We see second peak during the second session, a high peak. It's when their representatives of European Solidarity were supporting People's Servant with their votes. Also, we observe certain peaks during third and fourth session in other oppositional fractions. Another split of monomajority has taken place after the beginning of the full-scale invasion, and during summer 2022 there was a certain crisis related to the fact that the People's Servant could not get a sufficient amount of necessary votes, and since the beginning of the full-scale invasion until summer, they were voting for the laws. They were adopting the laws with the support of other colleagues from Golos, The Voice, and European Solidarity. But starting from March 23, we observe a drastic change in behavior of former representatives of oppositional bloc. The picture is very dramatic with the oppositional bloc for life fraction. Basically, the biggest anti-reformers of the parliament were sitting there, and as we see, the rating for the fifth session has not exceeded 20%, and drastically they start voting on par with Dariia, the trust, and they achieve certain indicators of people's servant. And what we were able to see that in some important draft laws, the key votes were added by opposition bloc in order to promote those draft laws that were not voted for by Golos, The Voice, or ES, the European Solidarity. So there's a number of reasons behind that. Probably one of them is because the representatives of pro-Russian parties are afraid to be deprived of their mandates, and this is why they've changed their behavior dramatically. So to summarize it, the average performance ratio within 10 sessions is 68%, which is way bigger than the indicator for the previous parliament. It's 11% bigger. And I think that this result is achieved thanks to the coordinated voting and discipline in the ranks of people's servant. Also, in the beginning, this parliament demonstrated pretty good results in terms of attendance, but they fell down, specifically during the full-scale invasion, when a large number of people's deputies started missing the parliamentary sessions. Also, our rating contemplates division into groups. Conditionally, we divide them into reformers, pretty stable, but those who have rating ranging from 89 to 100%. Then moderate reformers, 40 to 88.99, and anti-reformers below 40%. Again, I would like to emphasize that in the ranks of people's servant there are no anti-reformers, and all of the reformers are either people's servants representatives or extra-fractional. All of the other reformers are related to the group of moderate reformers. Okay, so what is the number, the physical number of anti-reformers? It should be right on this slide. Here we can see the number of reformers and anti-reformers changing in percents. As we see in this picture, mathematically the number of reformers was growing, meanwhile the number of anti-reformers was decreasing. And as of the 10th session, we have one of the lowest indicators of anti-reformers, 17% only, but sometimes that percentage was reaching like 30%, but if I'm not mistaken, never exceeded that figure. So generally, this is what we have, such a traffic light, which looks pretty proportional. Well, obviously, I would like to have less anti-reformers here. On this slide, we can track deputy by deputy, not aggregated data, but every rating of every single deputy. What's interesting, the people's servants were very disciplined in the beginning. We see no deputy with rating below 80, maybe 70%, and during the days of work of the parliament, they got a little bit unfocused, and we see that some of the people's servants fall under the category of anti-reformers by the end of the 10th parliamentary session, and one of the most grouped fractions is opposition bloc for life. They were huddling around this up to 50% maximum rating, and during the sixth session, before they started helping the people's deputies, they were very, very well grouped anti-reformers. Some of them have increased their ratings, some of them have 100% ratings during the 10th session, so they look like a perfect reformers. Also, we can see the percentage of support of this or that reform by sectors. Well, people's servant has highest ratings in all sectors, but if we check out the human capital sector, it's supported even by those fractions which are very oppositional and do not support any other reform sectors. For example, European Solidarity, who in public finance and public administration adheres to the oppositional policy, human capital, which is not related to public administration, is supported by many fractions. And to finalize it, another interesting thing that we may draw from our rating, we may see the gender breakdown. And in reality, if we count it, if we divide them by the number of males and females, the ratings will be the same. The average performance ratio is 68%, but the difference is the strategy. As we can see, the ladies usually adhere to the moderate position. The smaller percentage among them is anti-reformers, and smaller percentage are the reformers. So they are usually somewhere in the middle. Meanwhile, the males are either destructive anti-reformers or they stay at the top of the ratings and they come there to stay, which results in pretty good average efficiency. And the last slide that I wanted to demonstrate, something that we were able to track with the help of performance ratio, the average ratio by regions. And ahead of everybody is Mykolaiv region with 93% rating of people's deputies efficiency. And on the left, we see that all of the majority deputies are the representatives of people's servant. And for example, talking about the last ratings, there are more like in Volynsk and Donetsk region. For example, in the Donetsk region, the majority deputies are representatives of Відновлення України, the reconstruction of Ukraine, and this is where we verify our statement that the tendency is unchanged about the people's servants. It's difficult to imagine how draft laws of reformation nature can be voted for from other fractions, knowing the fact that we have mono-majority. And this picture confirms it once again. Thank you very much for your attention. In case you have any questions, I'm open to any and all of them. Dariia, thank you very much for such a holistic study. It was really interesting. I would like to give the floor to the representative of CHESNO movement. I'm curious, as soon as you've seen it, we understand that the number of reformers, moderate reformers, is growing. So to what extent this information coincides with those approaches that you use? Thank you very much. It's a really interesting study. And with each slide, we have similar studies and data coincides. And during the time of the full-scale invasion, and the peak of people's servant was during Turbo regime. Then coronavirus came in, and the full-scale invasion significantly influenced this convocation, their attendance, their voting, the topics of the draft laws, and the data with regard to the change of the behavior of opposition bloc. We've noticed it too. It's clearly visible. They were the first, within the first couple of years, they were leaders in non-attendance, or they were voting against, and after the beginning of the full-scale invasion, they've minimized the percentage of their against votes. Meanwhile, those who were present in the parliament were voting And відновлення України, the reconstruction of Ukraine, it has different people's deputies who used to be the representatives of other parliamentary fractions. The situation is changing, but in my opinion, those are the situational alliances rather than constant practice. However, during the last couple of years, it becomes constant. So what also is interesting, I've paid attention to this anti-rating slide, which demonstrates quite vividly the data about voting, because those are the representatives of former oppositional bloc like Oleksandr and among the people's deputies of People's Servant, the percentage of support of Oleksandr was the lowest. Yet another interesting slide is about the reformers, about the fact that those are people's deputies, and it's again another good argument for David Arachamia, who was recently stating that some deputies are demotivated, and we were emphasizing that if some of the people's deputies are tired, please give the way to the new ones. The new blood is going to demonstrate the new results. This is confirmed by the results of the voting. The situation may change in a couple of months, but this is the trend anyway. This is why the restrictions of the martial law can be used to infuse this new blood to the parliament. It happened to the Голос, the Voice, and Слуга Народу, the People's Servant deputies within the last 2 years. Yet another important moment in CHESNO, we have similar analytics. For example, like long-awaited prohibition of Moscow Patriarchate Church. Is it a reform? Well, it's a matter subject to discussion, but it's of public importance. It's an important draft law one way or another. We were analyzing the draft law in the first reading, and then we'll see how the people's deputies are going to vote during the second reading, or, for example, the medical cannabis. And during in this convocation, we were able to eradicate the unauthorized voting by the peers. And then there was another practice when the people's deputies, in order not to undertake the legislative responsibility, they imitate their absence, and the Rada system yields the result like either absent or abstained from voting. Meanwhile, the people's deputies were physically present in the parliament. For example, one people's deputies during the voting for prohibition of Moscow Patriarchate Church just pulled their card from the reader device, having imitated the voting, in order not to take that political responsibility. But again, talking about the draft laws, we mostly talk here about the representatives of people's servants, and the people's servants representatives are usually the head of the parliamentary committees. The first co-authors of the draft laws are usually the heads of the committees, and again, usually those draft laws are more likely to be approved than the draft laws initiated by some separate deputies. So if we evaluate by this indicator, the heads of the committees are among the most efficient. And as we were analyzing the majority deputies, your slides reflect that picture. So there are deputies who registered 7 draft laws within 5 years, and only one of them was voted in. So imagine, within 5 years, a people's deputy submits just 1 draft law, or 7 draft laws registered, and only 1 was adopted. And if we check what kind of law was that, that was appealed to international organizations by the Ukrainian parliament. So if we evaluate registration by this indicator, like legislative spam and the percentage of those adopted, the situation is quite interesting. For example, there is a deputy Mazurash. He's the leader by number of draft laws, but among those which were adopted, it's only 12%. And talking about the draft laws initiated by President Zelensky, they are on the first place, then go the People's Deputies draft laws, and then Cabinet of Ministers ones. So I can keep talking about all of those nuances around and around, but once again, thank you very much for this survey, for this study. It coincides with our opinion, with the number of our materials. So thank you very much once again. Thank you. So, Ms. Oleksandr, let me give the floor to you for some reflections. Well, you were probably happy to see the results of this survey, and what we understand that the reforms is something that is being observed not only by the civil sector, but all of the Ukrainians, and now the reformers, they are gaining momentum. And our colleagues from Vox, they say that the number of reformation laws during the 10th session was way lower than during the previous ones. So are we losing a momentum, or is it because we've already adopted all of the Euro integration laws? Well, good morning, dear colleagues. We would like to thank Vox Ukraine for your study. And for me, as extra fractional deputy, you know, so some of the extra fractional deputies are staying in confinement cells. For example, some of them are former representatives of public servants, people's servants. And this is what I urge all of the surveyors, like, in their studies, please don't classify the extra fractional deputies as something homogeneous, because the only thing that unites us is the status. And according to this methodology, if you're absent, well, you're not a reformer. You lose the opportunity to get this status. So those are the small nuances. But why am I mentioning them now? Because during the next convocation, there will be 3 extra fractional deputies from the very beginning. So you cannot be extra fractional, because then you lose your mandate. That's why we have to review this methodology in terms of extra fractional. The members of Presidium, they cannot be always present, and there should be other requirements set for them. Well, I was reflecting on the the way the parliament works without the pressure from the electors. I think that within the last 2.5 years, the pressure on the members of parliament is way bigger than it used to be before. Like before the war, we were not seen shot in TikToks. We had re-elections, we had to resign, so there were less aggressive things happening to us, but the requirements significantly progressed, so to say, because the requirements to the government should be high during the war. You know, if the deputies act in a different way, we would have a lot of corruption cases or high treason cases. Some of the people's deputies, they are under home arrest. Some of them are in confinement cells. All those news get in. All those things they get in the news, and people start thinking, okay, what should we do about you? I mean, all this reformation agenda is being lost in the background like this. But again, yes, the war within the last 2.5 years, we've taken some more efforts in the sector of Euro integration. In the year 2022, we got the candidates minimum, 5 requirements, 7 requirements, then additional requirements, then some more and more. And it turned out that it's an ongoing story. And we may be able to observe some lack of rhythm there, because for a draft law to emerge, and in case of reformation draft laws, they should all undergo the full cycle, like white book, green book, inclusion, discussion. Everybody has to say their word. Now, during the full-scale invasion, all those stages were shortened, but according to my evaluations, very rough evaluations, for the draft law to be ready to go through the parliament, it's like 3 to 4 months, maybe half a year. Big systemic draft laws take at least half a year. So the way the reforms are going to happen is the way that they were going on within the last 2 years. We have the list of reforms. The main list is Euro integration, and a lot of them are going to rotate around Euro integration. In negotiations procedure, we see a lot of tasks related to synchronization with the European space, and that's going to form the basic agenda, because it contemplates like hundreds and thousands of draft laws. And talking about all those draft laws, we've adapted probably a half of them, because every rule is a draft law, and there is a lot of regulations in European Union. Many European directives should be adapted. Then we have the list of reforms related to our promises and obligations to different partners, like World Bank, International Monetary Fund, like one of the biggest partners, different sector agreements. For example, we know that the Rome Statute that the president suggested to be ratified shortly, and the parliament is going to ratify it soon, and it's present in different finance agreements. For example, the last one was with Japan. The government tries to put it all together in the reform matrix. It's a one file. It should be posted in the Ministry of Finance website, because they are responsible for all of the reforms. But again, your subjective evaluations, the score, the points, should be double-checked against the metrics, because from the point of view of the state, what can be considered a reformation law? Well, I'm not talking about evaluating of all of the regulations, but for example, if there are 30 draft laws that are in the metrics of Ministry of Finance and are on the EU joining list, so probably the majority of experts may say that those are all draft laws of reformation nature. Talking about their rhythmics, yes, previous session was smaller. The next 11th session will be bigger, because now there's a lot of draft laws that are related, that are on the registration stage. All of them are related to Ukraine facility, and as soon as we get funding, the majority of the draft laws are going to be voted in quicker. Also, some of the draft laws will be related to IMF, World Bank, reform of the counting chamber, and funding from the United States. Talking about the colleague reformers, I can discuss them publicly, but this methodology is not the new rating. We see that the new deputies become leaders in the rating because they have higher attendance, but there is a flip side. For example, Mikhailo Sokolov from Batkivshchina, he's the anti-rating leader. And talking about the division by sectors, that's quite an interesting component. I would pay attention to it as well, because judging by my rating, I've seen that I'm one of the biggest reformers, specifically in those sectors that I support: decentralization, the public governance reform. So probably I pay more attention to the fact that during this or that day, that specific draft law should be voted or worked on. And I think this is probably the vision of my colleagues, especially those who are involved in this or that reform. For example, if you're involved in working with certain reform for a long time, probably you pay more attention to it. And talking about the new deputies, the situation is unambiguous, because we see, according to the rating, they are better reformers. But within 5 years, the existing deputies, they've already set up horizontal ties with the committees, with the government, among themselves. So it's a matter of efficiency. Again, I understand that we're talking like experimentally, theoretically things here, because there's the 10th convocation. Our work was extended. No one knows for how long. In the history of Ukraine, there were 7 convocations that resigned and 2 convocations that were timely, and ours is the first one that was prolonged. Obviously, we have to work for the country, and then probably people will see the results of our work and will not discuss what negative measures should be taken into relation of the deputies. And talking about the reformation component, I would say 5 out of 7 promises on candidacy, and one of the promises is ours too. All of the additional promises and everything that is related to Ukraine facility, the money, the parliament is working on it. The majority of those things is the responsibility of the parliament. The president signs the laws. We're a team here. We work as a team there. The government develops the draft laws, but I know that one of the recommendations from our analysts, from our partners, is to increase the number of draft laws registered by the parliament, so we vote in more of them, or we adopt more of them. There is a practice when the deputies register an alternate law, and then there is a committee version provided, because the text provided by the government should be the one that satisfies the deputies. It should be about inclusion and other things to be taken into account, because the representatives of association visit the deputies or different other civil organizations. They come to our meetings and they say, like, you've put it a little bit wrong. We have to work on it more and find more understanding. Talking about legislative spam, you've given the example of our People's Deputy of this convocation, who is the champion here. And in the recommendations of Parliament reformation is written very strictly. Something has to be done with the legislative spam. No such thing is existent in the parliaments of Europe. We need some group responsibility. So but basically the constitution guarantees those authorities to the deputy. That's why we have to start this reform in a different place. There were reforms to limit number of draft laws by fraction, but again, that's still subject to discussion. Either we have to increase the level of political culture in the society and among the people's deputies, and people's deputies should realize that any activities of theirs related to the registration of this or that draft law will end up in the news, and you either do it to become famous, or you don't really realize the consequences of what you're doing. We had initiatives about bicycle generators and all those funny stories. That's why, once again, I really appreciate the invitation. Thank you for the study. Just like all of the works of CHESNO and Vox, it all helps rendering the parliament better, even if sometimes it may not seem so. Mr. Oleh, I would like to give the floor to you, and I would like to stop at the topic of legislative spam. We really see that this problem does exist, and the representative of civil society, probably you were working with this problem and you know what solutions can be applied here, because we understand it's a colossal load on the system that is forced to work on idle. Well, really, it remains one of the biggest problems in the work of the parliament, in my opinion, because we were conducting a study comparing Ukraine to other countries. For example, if 1,600 draft laws are registered in Ukraine within a year, we were checking Japan, Norway, Poland, Sweden. This indicator comes in dozens per year. In Italy, it was 600 per year. So this extensive number of draft laws results in inability of committees to process them, and we see that we have the dedicated study. Some of the draft laws are being discussed for months or even years, and another problem posed by the spam is when the people's deputies cannot sort out the draft laws themselves. They enjoy little support from the parliamentary fractions. They don't have time to discuss it. And for example, there was another problem, a low percentage of registered draft laws in part of the government. We were checking it too. Well, it's both ways. You know, if you check out the quantity, 13% of all of the registered draft laws are initiated by the government. And the level of their adoption abroad is pretty high. So yet another problem emerges here, and the problem is that the government-initiated draft law is supposed to go through a number of stages. First is discussion, then all of the parties hearing, and registering draft laws through people's deputies is way easier. And we were seeing such cases when the people's deputies register the laws, and in the supplementary note, it says that the draft law was developed by this or that agency, for example. Also, it was already mentioned how to solve those problems, but in fact, we have to change the constitution for that. We were able to see that the draft laws that were developed and finalized by the committees, the percentage of adoption is pretty high, 60%. So basically, it was taken into account all of the proposals of all of the interested parties. There was a discussion, and it demonstrates that such draft laws are being adopted quickly. Probably, really, we have to think about in this Cox Reformation recommendations, it was said that we have to register the number of initiators, or sometimes the recommendation was that the draft laws can be registered only when submitted by committees or a fraction, and in this case we understand the support would grow. Again, another thing I would like to mention, today in Ukraine we have the mono-majority. That's a unique phenomenon for a country, and respectively we would expect the reforms to be adopted real quick because there is political will, one political force, anything can happen. And even now we see that many reforms are being adopted under pressure from our partners. We see a lot of draft laws being adopted during the deadline, like as we're supposed to be checked, we adopted draft law, and even not always like that. You've already mentioned the accounting chamber. 1 year ago, G7 said that first we need to reform the agency and then to elect the management. But again, the management was appointed, and now we're waiting for the accounting chamber reform. Even regardless the international pressure, the reforms are not taking place in the way that we expect them to see, and the expert community sees. And another problem that I hear about from my colleagues is bad communication. So if we recall some big systemic reforms, like the reform of public service, it's clear that they take long, but they were declared. There was an explanation what should change. There were plans, programs, and only then it was implemented. Now, if we check it, those draft laws that are considered to be of reformation nature, that change something, they are really the ones that don't have a strategic plan. They solve one problem, and only in this way they are being adopted. So again, legislation spam and the way the problems are being discussed, we can check it based on the opinion of main judicial directorate, where the draft laws are being analyzed before the second reading, and I can bet, you can check any open draft law and you will see that the opinion is negative, and it's applicable to almost all of the draft laws. It's not in compliance with itself, constitution, other acts. It creates more uncertainty. And on one hand, we may say that some changes were adopted that may be considered reforms, but on the other hand, that new draft law may create more problems that are supposed to be solved in future. And many laws, such as tax code, they have a lot of modifications and amendments. More than 30 modifications are made to one code within 1 year. Thank you very much, and I would like to give the floor to my colleagues. Dear colleagues, if you have any questions, please, the floor is yours. Anna Samara, Suspilne Mовлення. I'm having a question to Mr. Oleksandr regarding the upcoming session of the parliament. So what exactly are you going to vote for? We know about the intentions to vote for prohibition of Moscow Patriarchate Church, but what are the other important draft laws that you will vote for? Well, the presentation of the study transformed into the briefing of the first deputy head of the parliament. Well, according to the decree, we're not disclosing time and place based on the decree adopted by the parliament that I do not violate. Meanwhile, other my colleagues do. So again, on the agenda, the first draft law is the one with the long name. It's related to the national security, and in fact, yes, that's the law that is called in the society the law on prohibition of Moscow Patriarchate Church. Also, there is a number of other presidential initiatives. By the way, the president expressed his support on this draft law. We were able to witness the support of his office. We were communicating with all Ukrainian Council of Churches and religious organizations and all of the Holy Fathers of all confessions, including Greek Catholic and, of course, the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. They've clearly stated that they support this law because this matter is something that is of concern in the society. Also, there is a number of laws. I don't remember the exact numbers, but there is a draft law that is supposed to guarantee the benefits, disbursements, rights, and all the social support for our military who perform combat operations in the territory of aggressor country. We understand that it's quite an important thing. Also, there is a law on deprivation of traitors of Ukraine, stripping them of their awards and benefits. Another important draft law is the international obligation, the Rome Statute. And another draft law that was registered during the ninth session, so basically half a year ago or even more. And it's supposed to make sure that our heroes who fight on the Ukrainian side and who are the citizens of other countries have the facilitated access to the Ukrainian citizenship. People from Georgia, Belarus, Russia, and other countries who definitely deserve having Ukrainian citizenship because they shed their blood for Ukraine. All of their families are in difficult condition due to absence of this status. They cannot get services from their countries because in any consulate of Russia, they would be arrested. Well, if we talk about Russians. So there is a number of initiatives related to defense and continuation of reformation steps in the area of Euro integration, social laws aimed at protection of rights of people with disabilities, and a number of ratifications of international documents that we work with a lot lately, and there's a lot of ratifications that allow us fill in the budget. We have a ratification with the Republic of South Korea. It creates big opportunities for the budget. We have ratification with Britain, but at the same time there is a withdrawal from the treaties with Belarus, Russia, and the CIS countries. The parliament is gradually working on it to bring us away from that legal field. And talking about reforms, money in exchange for reforms, this week, if the colleagues make it with the amendments, there will be amendments to the tax code adopted that would harmonize our tax and customs system with the one of European Union. And then, you know, on the 3rd of September, the 11th session starts. In the agenda, it says it shouldn't have happened, probably that just like 10th and 9th one. And the autumn session is traditionally the budget issues, the stem of a program, so to say. And we always know there are two budgets. That's the story that is with us from year to year. So we are going to correct the budget 2024 and discuss the budget 2025. There's a lot of news, so probably it will be one or probably another. So we're going to work on it. Thank you very much, dear colleagues. We have a time for just one small last question. Do we have any questions on the floor? Well, now that we don't have any questions on the floor, I would like to thank you for this interesting discussion. I would like to extend my special appreciation for all of you coming. It's good to have the representatives of the civil sector and the government sitting in one panel, and obviously I would like to thank our security and defense forces, thanks to whom we have an opportunity to hold events like this. So let's continue working for our victory, and glory to Ukraine.